This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 8 of season 5 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. Today we'll be interviewing Ben Kissling, who will address Bill Nye's points on the origins discussion. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Ben Kissling. Ben obtained his Bachelor of Science degree in Biochemistry from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is currently working on his Master of Arts degree in Science and Religion at Biola University. In his experience as a biochemist, Ben has worked in numerous laboratories, and he's also worked as a high school teacher. He was at one point a youth pastor, and now his passion for Christ Jesus continues as he teaches origin science. He's done 2 YouTube series, one on creation, evolution, and intelligent design, and the other on William Lane Craig's views of Genesis. Ben is also the host of the podcast Macrophage Strategy, a podcast about immunizing the body of Christ against foreign pathogens. And now, without further ado, good morning, Ben. How was your day, and how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Chris, and up bright and early and ready to go.
It's great to have you on again, Ben, and thank you for being on Current Topics in Science. And since this is Current Topics in Science, let's quickly look at this week's current topic. Today we're going to be reviewing an article by Professor of Evolutionary Paleobiology Matthew Wills, who teaches at the University of Bath. This article was originally published under the title, "Crabs Have Evolved 5 Separate Times. Why do the same forms keep appearing in nature?" And it was republished under the title, "Why Biology's Ultimate Comeback Story Could Debunk a Major Darwin Theory of Evolution." Notwithstanding, Professor Wills wrote, Charles Darwin believed evolution created endless forms most beautiful. It's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't explain why evolution keeps making crabs. Scientists have long wondered whether there are limits to what evolution can do, or if Darwin had the right idea. The truth may lie somewhere between the two. While there doesn't seem to be a ceiling on the number of species that might evolve, there may be restraints on how many fundamental forms those species can evolve into. The evolution of crab-like creatures may be one of the best examples of this, since they've evolved not just once, but at least 5 times. Unfortunately, we can't run evolutionary experiments to see if the same things keep happening because that would take hundreds of millions of years. But the history of life has already done something similar to that for us, when closely related lineages evolve and diversify on different continents. In many cases, their ancestral lines repeatedly come up with the same or almost identical solutions to problems. Ben, what do you think of this article? What are the limits to evolution?
Okay, so the article is talking about something called convergent evolution, which was, I don't know if it was invented or by this guy, but it was really pushed by a paleontologist a few decades ago named Simon Conway Morris. And he was famous for working on fossils in a rock formation called the Burgess Shale in Canada. And he was kind of in the school of Gould and Eldridge a little bit, where he says we need to look at what the fossils are saying to us and not what Darwinian theory demands, okay? And what he said is basically this, that you find examples of these types of convergent evolution all throughout the evolutionary tree, where similar features evolve, right, in completely separated or divergent branches of the tree, where neither branch had those features when they had a common ancestral population. Okay, so the common ancestral population did not have the feature. The 2 branches diverge, and then they both evolve the same features later on. That's called convergent evolution. So he was just going with what the evidence seemed to show from an evolutionary lens, is these populations have features that are the same. And the problem that that poses for evolution is systemic, because it's so common. And what ended up happening in the history of the field is they ended up having to differentiate between features that were similar due to common descent and features that were similar not due to common descent. And they came up with two words to differentiate the two things. Homology is an old concept in evolutionary theory. Homology, they used to argue that, well, things must have a common ancestor because they have similar features, and that's called homology. But now they define homology as similarities due to common descent, which means you can't use homology as evidence for common descent because it's a definition now, right? So the word they use for features that are not due to common descent is analogy, or analogy, analogous features. And so it really kind of makes you wonder when you sit back and look at the whole thing, well, didn't they just remove similar features as evidence for universal common descent? Because how can you tell which features are due to common descent and which are not? So I've actually had some interesting discussions with PhD biologists online about this, and they will argue up one wall and down the other that this is not a self-defeating position. Um, and they tie themselves into knots trying to explain why it's totally fine to define homology as features due to common descent, but yet it's still evidence of evolution. um it's you're defining yourself to be right. It's not evidence. And the thing that this where this really gets interesting is when you get into outside of morphology. So this article is talking about broad basic body plans of crabs, right? That's called morphology. But when you get into phylogenetics, you might think, well, we can figure out what really happened by looking at genetic similarities, because that's the basis of physical features, is genetics. And so you could look at the sequences themselves and sort of parse out which mutations occurred where and throughout a lineage, and kind of try and infer back to an ancestral population through genetics. But it turns out they have the same problem in genetics, because you can't tell which sequences you should base your tree on. And so people have come up with all these different criteria of which sequences to exclude from the analysis so you can get a tree. And this, in the evolutionary literature, this is called filters. They'll talk about filters in a phylogenetics paper, and what a filter is just a criteria for excluding certain sequences because they mess up your analysis. So that would be like an analogous features, things that are similar, but they're supposedly, you're saying, well, they're not really indicative of common descent, and so you exclude them from the analysis, right? And the other term they use is they say things like, we want to study only sequences that have a strong phylogenetic signal. Well, what does that mean? A strong phylogenetic signal just means sequences that resolve into the tree that we expect it to resolve into. So this is a huge problem in evolutionary theory, and it was brought about by the evidence itself. It was brought about by people honestly looking at the evidence and saying, science has to be beholden to the evidence and not to a theory. So convergent evolution, it's a big problem for having a coherent view of evolutionary theory, but it's an evidence-based position.
I was just listening to you speak, and I'm kind of getting the impression, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Doesn't this sort of like then make the evolutionary theory unfalsifiable if something that is evidence against it can kind of sort of be then turned on its head and now actually this has been a part of our theory this whole time? Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. The problem though is that most scientific theories in the end are most likely unfalsifiable. Falsifiability was rejected as what's called a demarcation criteria, meaning a criteria that separates science from non-science. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I could talk forever about that, but basically, falsifiability is something that scientists should pay attention to. It's important, and you should try to make your theory falsifiable. But if you try to say that anything that's non-falsifiable isn't science, you're going to have a problem with things that everyone agrees on. It does make it non-falsifiable, but what's more interesting to me is that it means that the theory is ceasing to be useful in describing data that we have, because it's increasingly apparent that the whole thing is mostly just arbitrary and it doesn't really explain anything. But yeah, it does make it non-falsifiable because any difference between, groups, you say, oh, well, that's evolution. See, they diverge, they're different. And then any similarity is, well, that's due to common descent. Okay, but what does that really tell you about anything? Nothing. It's not a useful way to look at biology.
So, Ben, thank you for addressing that. It sounds like you're saying that the theory of evolution, it can't accomplish the task that it set up for itself. Contrastingly, Bill Nye, known to many as the science guy, has an extraordinarily high view of the evolutionary theory. Bill Nye is a mechanical engineer and a science educator, and he's the author of the book Undeniable: Evolution and the Science of Creation. Nye wrote, "Evolution is one of the most powerful and important ideas ever developed in the history of science. Every question it raises leads to new answers, new discoveries, and new, smarter questions. The science of evolution is as expansive as nature itself. It's also the most meaningful creation story that humans have ever found." Ben, do you think that Nye's description of the importance of evolutionary theory is correct? And how do you think both the scientific community and lay people should view evolutionary theory?
Yeah, so I actually read that quote, and I was actually having a hard time finding anything that I disagreed with in the actual quote. Evolution is an important idea in the history of science, and it is one of the most important ever developed because it undermined the creation narrative that had held until that time. It is also, I mean, I wouldn't say probably the most meaningful creation story, but it is a meaningful creation story. If you accept evolution as your creation myth, it is going to affect the way you view yourself and other people and the world. You'll notice nothing he says in that actual quote. He never says evolution is true. Now, he might say that in other places, I don't know, but not in the quote that you gave me. The science of evolution is as expansive as nature itself. Yeah, that would be the one I don't agree with. um, there's, evolutionary theory is increasingly irrelevant to doing science because of one of the reasons is the issue we just talked about. It's increasingly difficult to see why evolutionary theory helps us understand nature rather than is dragging us down a little bit. But as far as and it's an important idea, yeah, absolutely. It had a lot of important consequences. And yeah, it's absolutely a creation story, and it was intended originally to be a replacement creation myth. It was intended to replace the Christian creation myth in Genesis. And I just got done criticizing another view of Genesis, right, where William Lane Craig called it mytho-history. And I'm comfortable calling the Genesis narrative a myth because the term myth doesn't necessarily mean it's false, right? Craig used a different definition of myth, but I like C.S. Lewis's definition of myth, where he says a myth is basically a story that undergirds an entire culture and a worldview that's representative of a particular culture. And evolutionary theory absolutely is that. It's going to be the foundation of your worldview if you believe it. And there are some serious consequences for that down the road. But I think they should view evolutionary theory the same way they should view any scientific theory. And that is, it is a way of making sense of a large amount of data that is likely false. It doesn't mean it's bad. I think it has moral consequences and has had moral consequences. But scientifically speaking, I accept that evolutionary theory is a scientific theory. It's just it doesn't work anymore, and we need it. We need a new view to accommodate all the data that we have today. It's an old theory and it's out of date, and it's time to move on. And part of the problem with moving on is that most of the people who had invested themselves in evolutionary theory as a science are unwilling to consider certain ways of moving on, such as a more creationist perspective or an intelligent design perspective, at least.
Well, Ben, thank you for sharing your thoughts on how one should approach the origins debate, as this is an important discussion. And I think all sides of the origins debate, from the evolutionists to the creationists of all kinds and the intelligent design advocates, I think we'd all say that we feel very passionately about the position that we hold to. And speaking of passion, in his opening statement in the famous 2014 debate at the Creation Museum between Bill Nye and Ken Ham, Bill Nye said, "Now I just want to remind us all, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, who get enriched, who have a wonderful sense of community from their religion. They worship together, they eat together, they live in their communities and enjoy each other's company, billions of people. But these same people do not embrace the extraordinary view that the earth is somehow only 6,000 years old. That is unique. And here's my concern. What keeps the United States ahead, what makes the United States a world leader, is our technology, our new ideas, our innovations. If we continue to eschew science, eschew the process, and try to divide science into observational science and historic science, we're not going to move forward. We will not embrace natural laws. We will not make discoveries. We will not invent and innovate and stay ahead." Ben, what do you think of Nye's comments? And if you disagree with him, what evidence would you present that creation science is a benefit and not a bane to scientific progress?
Okay. So there's a lot I disagree with in that statement. So taking the first one that I saw, he this is a common argument that's made, is that young earth creationism is unique to the United States. It's essentially what he's saying, that it's only a problem here in the United States because of Christian fundamentalism or something. That's not true at all. I don't know of any surveys that have been done in places like Africa or South America. Um, Certainly in Europe, there's not a lot of young earth creationists, but they are there. They are there. I know quite a few, especially in Britain. But it's just obviously not true historically. Historically, all Christians were young earth creationists until the 1700s or so. And in case you forgot, the United States was not colonized by Europeans until the 1600s, right? So for most of that time, it was not United States fundamentalism that were young earth creationists. But I'd be willing to bet actually that there are probably more young earth creationists in Africa than in the United States today. And that is because Africa has twice the population we do, and they are increasingly Christian. The reason why atheists and scientists make an issue of it in the United States is because the United States is where most of the scientific funding comes from in the world. It's the place to do science. Okay, and so if you're concerned about science, you think of yourself as sort of a transnational seeker of truth, and then you look at the specific community in the United States where you go to get money for doing science, and you look at that population and like, you guys don't believe what we do. Well, have you ever been to Africa? There's lots of young Earth creationists in other places in the world. It's just in the United States, there's more money. And so you have institutions like Answers in Genesis that have larger budgets that can spend time to really promote the view and develop it in a scientific and serious way. And that's why they focus on the United States. It's because it's most developed here in terms of a scholarly pursuit, creation science is. It's not because it's not prevalent anywhere else. uh, so this is another common argument that is made. He makes the argument that if we don't reject young Earth creationism, in the future we'll be worse off. Now, I like to think of this as the sort of pagan priest argument, where science is a false god who has been blessing you, but now the god is mad at you because you rejected it or made it mad somehow, and now it's not going to bless you anymore. And so in order to get back in the good graces of the false god science, we have to change our beliefs and in ways that have nothing whatsoever to do with economic prosperity, uh, and appease this God so that it will shower her blessings upon us in the future. If anything, I mean, the United States has been extremely successful economically, in innovation, in economics, socially, extremely successful in the past few centuries. And yet, as you go back in time, the percentage of our population that are young Earth creationists is only going up. So at what point in history do you think it's been clearly shown that acceptance of creation science leads to, decline? We're in decline now, when we have the least amount of young Earth creationists that we've ever had, probably. That's the correlation there. If there, I don't think there's a direct one-to-one correlation, but if there was one, that would be it. But it's a dumb argument anyway. It makes no sense. What is true doesn't necessarily mean is not necessarily going to align with what is going to make you successful economically as a culture. He would have to make that argument first. I just don't see the connection. And so the last part of your question, though, I do want to answer, sorry, before we move on, is what evidence would you present that creation science is a benefit to scientific progress? Quite simply, because creation science teaches you to look at all the evidence and not just what you were taught in school. It teaches you to question the typical way of looking at things, and that is scientific thinking, to be skeptical and always know why you believe what you believe. I've talked to so many evolutionists, lay people usually, who are not scientists, who run around saying ridiculous things because they think that science is like mathematics, where there's only one right answer to every question, and you should never question it. And if you do, you're an idiot. That's not a good way to practice science. A good way to practice science is to simultaneously hold in your head multiple competing hypotheses and measure the evidence and see which one is the best explanation of the evidence. And young Earth creationists, I can attest to this personally. We grow up being painfully aware of the two different models because we're getting one from the culture and from public school and all the rest, from movies, from everywhere. And the other one comes from wherever, our parents or the church or wherever we had an influence from young Earth creation. And so you're always having to weigh the two models, and you're painfully aware from a very young age that, there are competing explanations that people of good faith on both sides believe for good reasons. And this is not a black and white issue, right? It's not like some evil person wakes up some morning and says, I'm going to lie to everyone today and make someone believe something stupid. People believe things for reasons. And, just because they're the ones in control of the education system doesn't mean they're the only view that's legitimate or right. And that is encouraging. That is useful to science, to be the scientist who will stand up and say, now, wait a minute, there's another way of looking at this. Have we tried that? and check it out and see, because that's how scientific progress happens. So there's nothing inherently undermining of science and having a different view about it. In fact, I would say it's supporting of the scientific impulse to learn new things by questioning old things.
Ben, thank you for reviewing those comments from Nye's opening statement. And now that we've covered that, these next few questions will cover 3 of the specific arguments that Nye mentioned in his debate with Ken Ham, specifically those relevant to biology. The first argument that we'll be looking at is Bill Nye's argument about speciation being a problem for the young Earth creation model. At around minute marker 53, Bill Nye starts to make a calculation where he divides the estimated amount of species on Earth today, which he lists as 16 million, by the 4,000 years since the Genesis flood and 365 and a quarter days in a year. And so he believes that his result suggests that under the young Earth creation model, 11 new species would have to form every day since the Genesis flood. Ben, how do you address this calculation from Nye?
Okay, well, I don't know where he's getting those numbers. I would have to see where he got the numbers from, but I've seen different numbers. So, Hugh Ross, I think, says something like 28 million species or something that had to be evolved. And when he makes the same kind of argument, the best treatment of this subject is, I think, that book that's on your shelf right there, Replacing Darwin by Nathaniel Jeanson. In that book, Jeanson drills down and says, okay, where's the best evidence for observation of a speciation event, and how long can we say that it took? And he comes up with an estimate of about 100 years for speciation event. I think I want to say it was in a North American bird population. And he applies this to the question. Now, one thing before, most of those numbers, and he even said this in the debate, most of those numbers come from bacteria and viruses. And he said viruses as well. It's like, are you going to count viruses as alive, as a species now? Like, that's a debate in and of itself. The term species is fraught with difficulty. Like, I used to think that there was a clear definition of the term species, meaning that it was a isolated breeding population, like they can only breed with each other or something. But it turns out it gets very furry, blurry around the edges, and it's hard to define what a species is. But what Jeanson does is he assumes the biblical model of kinds. What Jeanson does is he shows that there is a pattern of the number of species, okay, that corresponds better to a creation model. And here's the main point, is that under an evolutionary model, you would expect the number of species to grow exponentially, because each new species is not distinguished from any other species. And therefore, you'd expect roughly the same new speciation rate to apply to each new species, which is a recipe for exponential growth of the number of species. Okay. But on a creation model, you would expect the rate of speciation to go down as the number of species rises. Okay, because those species are within the boundaries of their kind, their biblical kind, or baramen. I can't remember if he uses the word baramen. I think he talks about it briefly. But so there's boundaries, and within those boundaries, you can vary quite a lot. Okay, but once all those lanes and the boundaries are full, you can't keep changing, right? And so when there's more species within a biblical kind, there's going to be lower number of speciation events per species, because in the end, species is not the main criteria. It's for a creation model, it's the biblical kind, and it's a much wider category than species. So I would recommend that you would go and read that book if you want a real answer to this question, because Jeanson actually brilliantly turns it into an argument for a young Earth position, because the rate of speciation matches a creationist model and expectation better than an evolutionary model.
Well, thank you for addressing Nye's point there, Ben. And speaking of the species production, Bill Nye made the case that sexual reproduction evolved due to the fact that organisms that are capable of sexual reproduction can have better immunity to diseases and illnesses. At around 1 hour and 4 minutes into the debate, Bill Nye cited top minnows because the ones who reproduce sexually had fewer parasites than the ones that reproduced on their own. Ben, do you find Nye's explanation of how sexual reproduction arose convincing? And if not, why?
Well, no. And it's because of a very simple, argument ad absurdum. It would be very beneficial to me to have X-ray vision. Therefore, someday humans will evolve X-ray vision. It would be beneficial if humans were to develop the ability to levitate. And so that, as night follows day, that means we will evolve levitation in the future. Uh, this is a really bad argument that is really old-fashioned. Evolutionists used to make this kind of argument all the time. I haven't seen it a lot recently. They've been humbled recently. But you do have to, you can't just say something happened due to evolution because it provides an advantage. You have to have an explanation of how it could physically happen. And you have to put boundaries on it. But, I once had a discussion about this online, a long discussion, and where I posed the question to evolutionists, could a polar bear eventually evolve penguin feathers? And the reason I chose those is because both are highly suited to cold environments, but they deal with the same environmental pressure very differently. And so the question is, why couldn't a polar bear eventually evolve penguin feathers? If you're saying that penguin feathers evolved because they were increasingly better at dealing with the cold, and they evolved from hair, why wouldn't a polar bear also evolve penguin feathers over time? You know, and so the answer you'll eventually get from an evolutionist is that they think there's a ratchet in evolution where slowly creatures become more and more fit, and that locks them into a certain path in a certain direction. Okay, and they can't traverse the path in the reverse direction. Micheal Behe noticed this, and it's actually called something. It's called Dallow's law. And Behe suggested, and the problem with it is, if you think it's unlikely to evolve in the reverse direction, why? And they'll answer. It's basically an improbability argument, because there's no serious, like, if every step along the evolutionary path was favored by selection, which they have to say, then why couldn't you say that, well, what happened is the environment changed back to where the polar bear came from, right? And in each successive step, the environment now favored a feature that it used to have and didn't have it and doesn't have. And so it evolves backwards by selective pressures from the environment until it reaches the common ancestor between itself and penguins. And then the environment changes again and goes back into the cold, and now it evolves the way the penguins did. And you ask them why that couldn't be true, and they say because it's improbable. Behe suggested an asymmetric Dallow's law, which argues that the improbability argument works both ways. If it's improbable going in the reverse direction, it's improbable going in the forward direction as well. And so evolutionists have a real problem here. It's not something evolutionists really think about. And they think the way Nye thinks, that, well, this is a good thing for the species, and therefore it must have evolved. Designers can design good features in a species as well. And furthermore, evolutionists are commonly making arguments about bad design and saying, well, it couldn't have been designed by a good God because it's a bad design. And evolution explains it because it's not optimal. Like, does evolution cause optimal features or not? every view has to explain things that appear to be suboptimal and things that appear to be optimal. A creationist explains that by saying the original creation was good and optimal, and it has degraded since then because of the fall. We have a clear explanation for that. Okay, the evolutionist is stuck in this relativistic place where he's simultaneously arguing that everything that's good was caused by evolution because it's good, and everything that's bad was caused by evolution because it's bad. Like, that's a bad solution, which is just what we'd expect from evolution, right? And rather than from a designer. But if it's good, well, it's just what we'd expect from evolution. That shows the power of natural selection. So, I mean, this is kind of a simplistic argument in my opinion. I made a more general argument rather than responding directly about sexual reproduction versus not, you know. So I would ask, if I was in a debate with him, I would ask Bill Nye, why didn't sexual reproduction evolve in every population then? I guess he would probably say, well, in multicellular organisms or something, but there are multicellular organisms that don't reproduce sexually, lots of them, and especially plants, mushrooms and things like that. If they required protection against parasites, oh, why didn't they evolve that? And it gets back to the whole convergent evolution thing. So, I mean, I hope that's a good answer, but the truth is that there's not really a clear claim being made there. I would have to ask some more critical questions to get him into an actual position, and my suspicion is he would never take one. He would just continue making these kind of surfacey arguments that sound good if you don't think about it too much.
For the final biological argument that we'll be reviewing from Nye, at around 50 minutes of the debate, Nye showed an image that had approximately 50 skulls on it. This image he cited as evidence against the idea that humans were created, as he believes that these hominid skulls are a reflection of human evolution. Ben, we're going to cover more about human evolution for our final question. However, for now, can you tell us, do the different kinds of hominid skulls demonstrate that humans have evolved?
No. Um, I don't know. I probably thought of saying here about how you can put 50 skulls of modern humans up on a shelf somewhere and invent a pathway of evolution based on whatever criteria you want. There's lots of examples of modern humans that have weirdly shaped skulls. You can adjust the shape of your skull by repeated pressure. And there have been, some tribal cultures who did that as sort of like a foot binding type thing, where, and I know they've done it for necks. You remember the African people where they will put this metal bracelet around the neck of women, and over time it pushes their collarbone down and makes their neck look longer and more slender. And if you found their skeleton, and you would say, well, that's a different species than human beings. No, it's not. They just had a different environment that they were in that caused certain kinds of pressures on their bones that deformed them. The other issue is there's lots of genetic diversity, enough in the human race today to explain different skull shapes. They certainly seem to be genetic in some of those populations because they found similar ones living together. So most of the difference there is probably genetic. So Neanderthals increasingly are viewed as inbred, and so they had a lot of genetic problems, and that probably affected the shape of their bone structure.
Well, Ben, thank you for reviewing those points from Bill Nye. And now that we've gotten a chance to hear some of the points raised by Nye in the debate, let's take a look at several of the takes that were brought up in the aftermath of the debate. Professor Micheal Behe's comments on the debate were recorded by the Christian Science Monitor. Professor Behe said, "I was upset that both parties kept talking about the age of the earth rather than on the elegance and complexities of life." Ben, as somebody who is a biochemist like Professor Behe, what biochemical challenges does the evolutionary and the creationary theory still have left to answer? And does one explanation have more explanatory power than the other?
Yeah, so Biochemical challenges to evolutionary theory are myriad. I think the strongest one is the one I was starting into earlier. Douglas Axe has done some really good work on the stability of protein folds and shown that stable functional protein folds are very rare in the protein sequence space. And they're so rare it's very unlikely to be found by a random search. That's a challenge, and that has grown more difficult, not less, over time. That result was generalized now. So there was a study that did like 10 different proteins and studied the effect of individual point mutations on their structure, and showed that about a third of mutations are destabilizing. And that essentially, if you follow the logic, it leads to a general equation that is 1/3 to the n power, and the n means the number of amino acids in the protein sequence. And if you put in 153, which is the length of the protein that Axe studied, you get the number that he got with a completely different experiment. Okay, so this is a very well understood thing now, is that proteins are extremely sensitive to mutations, particularly in the negative way. And Behe has done a lot of work over the years demonstrating that gain-of-function mutations are very rare. So that's, I think, the main biochemical challenge. And of course, Behe's argument is that design things are the purposeful arrangement of parts. Random chance can't purposefully arrange different parts together for a cohesive whole. That's a significant challenge. But creationary theory, biochemical challenges. Well, some of them I've addressed in some of my videos about how do you explain the long ages of the people in Genesis 5, and the fact that their ages precipitously declined after the flood, like in a deep exponential curve. That's something that would be interesting to look at. But I think really the main one is classifying the biblical kinds. I think that the only way we're going to be able to do that is to have a full understanding of populations biochemically and genetically, and to kind of understand biochemically what are the boundaries of the biblical kinds. And only then can you really start to draw the barriers between baramins. And people have been trying to do that in the same way that evolutionists do taxonomy, where they and you had to, back, even Linnaeus did this, right? And he wasn't an evolutionist. But you look at morphology, things that you can see, shapes of limbs and numbers of digits and things like that. But ultimately, I think that is a biochemical question, is where is the real barrier between kinds? And that's a big challenge, because that means you basically have to almost exhaustively know an organism biochemically to sort of even answer that question. But we're getting there with model systems like E. coli, simple ones, where we've mapped out the whole genetic system and all the proteins and what they all do. And so, it's a question that's approaching being able to be answered in limited cases. So that's a big challenge.
Ben, in our last question, the creation and the evolutionary origin explanations were pitted against one another. However, some would argue that this is a false dichotomy. Deborah Haarsma, an astronomer and president of BioLogos, wrote these preliminary comments prior to the debate that Ken Ham and Bill Nye had. She stated, "We at BioLogos maintain that you don't have to choose. You don't have to give up Christian faith in order to accept the best, most compelling science. We expect that we'll agree with most of what Bill Nye will say about the science of evolution. Fossils, genetics, and other disciplines give compelling evidence that all life on Earth is related and developed over a very long time through natural processes. But we're also brothers and sisters in Christ with Ken Ham. We believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died for our sins and rose from the dead, and that the Bible is the authoritative Word of God." Ben, as someone who has studied the relationship between science and religion, do you believe that her analysis is correct? How do science and faith relate to one another?
Yeah, and that's the theistic evolution position, that we have to accept everything that science says because, and you notice again, she doesn't say it must be true. So, and she doesn't even say it's authoritative. Why not? Because she knows that science is not authoritative in the end. We expect it to evolve. We expect scientific understanding to change in the future. We expect radical paradigm shifts of understanding. So the question I've always had, the broader question for theistic evolutionists like Harzma, is why do you think that we have to believe that everything science says is true? That's a biblical doctrine. A Christian doctrine of inerrancy is about the Bible. It's not about science. So where are you getting this idea that we have to accept as true everything from that scientists say, right? And there is no one science. They speak like science is a thing. Again, it's the sort of the false god thing where there's a single monolithic being that speaks to us. That's not what science is. It's a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions. Which one is the one she's taking as authoritative? But the real problem, with theistic evolution is I think there is a actual theological problem with theistic evolution, and that is, how do you reconcile the Christian doctrine of creation with evolutionary theory, particularly Darwinian theory, which says that random mutations are acted on by natural selection to produce all of biological diversity. You got to drill down onto what random means. And I don't know what Harzma's take on that is, but my impression of her in a few articles I've read is that she kind of glosses over it a lot, which is what theistic evolutionists tend to do. They say, well, there's no problem in saying God created with evolution. We can believe both. What's the problem? Well, it depends on what you mean by evolution. And I've written some technical work on this in papers for class. I'm probably going to try and publish it at some point. But evolutionary theory intended to, from the beginning by Darwin, to remove God from his position as the creator. And Darwin argued this almost explicitly when he argued that he made the argument from bad design. And he was saying, we need to remove God as the creator, otherwise he is evil. And that was the intention of evolutionary theory from the beginning. And so for theistic evolutionists to come back 100 some years later and say, no, not really, they're going to have to deal with the fact that evolutionary theory was always understood that way and still is today. And it's constructed that way. You gotta define what you mean by random, and they'll say, well, random doesn't mean pure chance, right? God is really controlling the random mutations. Well, doesn't that mean they're not random? Doesn't that mean evolutionary theory is false and we shouldn't believe it? You don't get answers to those kinds of questions in my experience, because to answer it is to undermine the theistic evolutionist position. And they failed to come up with a serious explanation for why the doctrine of creation is compatible with evolutionary theory. And nowadays, they ignore the problem. That's what they do. And so I think TEs are kind of fading.
Ben, we've reviewed several of Nye's arguments together in this interview. But let's imagine for a moment that you had the opportunity to debate with Nye. What points would you have raised if you were debating, is creation a viable model of origins with Bill Nye?
Well, the problem with debating somebody like Nye is he's in that debate with him. He's throwing out a bunch of arguments really fast, and he's trying to cram a bunch of arguments in a short amount of time, which is, that's what you would do. But it's impossible to deal with all of them in the space of a debate like that. And so what I would do first is I would quickly uh, pin him down on a couple of really egregious errors that he made. And after that, which I can talk about that in a second. But after that, what I would do is the same thing that he did, is I would go through all the evidence for young Earth, scientific evidence, and I would explain them one by one as fast as I can. Okay. Two specific errors really stood out to me. One of them, when I heard him say this, I literally laughed for about 30 seconds in a row. And you think that doesn't sound like a long time, but try laughing for 30 seconds and timing yourself. He said that Fred Hoyle invented Big Bang Theory. And if you understand the absurdity of that statement, it's really funny, because Fred Hoyle was an astrophysicist who was the most vociferous public proponent of the steady state theory, which was the alternative to the Big Bang Theory at the time. Now, what probably happened there when Nye was reading some Wiki page or skimming some Wikipedia page on this and not understanding what was going on, is he probably read somewhere that Fred Hoyle coined the term Big Bang Theory, which is true, but he meant it as a derogatory term. And Nye, I don't remember exactly what he said, but Nye said Fred Hoyle suggested that things are expanding in a big bang, and after this insight, something, 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 it's clear he thought that Fred Hoyle invented the Big Bang Theory. When in reality, he was the most vocal and most famous opponent of it. Another major error, or when he was talking about the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation, he claimed that Big Bang theorists predicted exactly the temperature of the cosmic microwave background radiation. And he said it twice, I think. He said exactly, exactly. He emphasized it like it was perfect, like a perfect prediction. The problem is it wasn't. And I'm not even sure that Nye understands what the prediction was, because if I recall right, I don't think he even used the term temperature. But that was the prediction that he was talking about. The prediction was the cosmic microwave background radiation would be 5 Kelvin, which is 5 degrees above absolute zero. Okay. The actual value was very precise, and it's measured as 2.73 Kelvin. Okay. That's not an exact prediction. Now, that counts as a successful prediction in astrophysics because it's within an order of magnitude. Astrophysical theories are so like difficult and out there that you count them as successful predictions if they're within even 2 orders of magnitude sometimes, which is a multiplier of 100. Okay, and so Russell Humphreys has made predictions that are within a factor of 2, which is that prediction of the Big Bang, 2.73 and 5. Russell Humphreys has made predictions of the strength of the planetary magnetic fields of Neptune and Uranus that were within a factor of 2 of the actual value. And the Big Bang theory, or not the Big Bang theorists, but effectively that crowd, they were wrong about a lot of that. They were way off. And so that would be where I would probably start. And I would just start going through all the evidences from planetary magnetic fields to why a magnetic field cannot last billions of years. And therefore, you have to come up with some theory as to how the electrical current that generates the field is regenerated, because it would be constantly losing energy from resistance. And I would just continue with stories like that of evidence after evidence, argument, the same thing that Nye did, and make all the positive cases and explain them clearly to people so they understand that this is not just a simple thing of all the evidence is one way or the other. If you don't give the evidence from your side, people think there isn't any. And so they're not going to appreciate when you just spend all your time like undermining what he said. So that's how I would do it. But
Well, Ben, we've now come to our final question. And I want to return to the article by Professor Wills that we mentioned at the beginning of our interview together. He concluded his article with a discussion on whether or not humans are special or significant in any way. His answer was, many of the things that we think make humans special have been reinvented by evolution elsewhere. Corvids like crows and ravens have problem-solving intelligence, and along with owls can use simple tools. Whales and dolphins have complex social structures, and their big brains allow them to develop language. Dolphins use tools like sponges to cover their noses when they forage across stony sea bottoms. Octopuses also use tools and learn from watching what happens to other octopuses. Ben, is this true? Are human beings simply the reinventions of the process of evolution? Is there anything that makes a human life special?
Language is one of the things that makes human beings special. I don't think it's true that whales and dolphins have a language. But be that as it may, this is the problem with evolutionary theory as a social or moral matter, is that it refuses to distinguish between human beings and animals. And when you do that, you have all kinds of problems morally. It undermines the way we should treat each other as human beings, the way we should treat ourselves as human beings, as people who have dominion over the animals, because we have certain abilities that they do not. Reason, free will, language, which I think are tied to the previous two things. We also, I think we have an immaterial soul that animals don't have. And that is why, God sent his son to the world to save our souls, because we're the ones who are, we're the reason for the season, so to speak, right? And if you don't believe that, you start to have these views where like we're not special. And so I was just talking about a biologist at University of Texas named Eric Pianka, who died last September. He very clearly believes that it is unfair for human beings to use as many resources of the earth as we do, because we're not special. And he thinks that we should control and limit our population to be more fair to animals. Okay, and that's the beginning of some very ugly views that have led very, very bad places in the past. And if you don't understand all this science stuff, understand that evolutionary theory, as G.K. Chesterton once said, it doesn't so much get rid of God as gets rid of man. It gets rid of human beings. And as Genesis says, only human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. And only we have that kind of moral worth and inherent value. And so you shouldn't be sacrificing humanity for the sake of animal populations. And that's the big problem with this kind of view.
Ben, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Ben's biographical information, his lectures, and more information in the description. Additionally, you'll also find his podcast, Macrophage Strategy, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's book, Replacing Darwin, and a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.